In this video, we're going to take a look at Final Gather. Final Gather is an indirect lighting method that simulates global illumination. It also allows light to bounce from one object to another. Normally, inside of the CG world, a light is emitted from a ray, hits an object, and stops. Utilizing Final Gather will allow that ray to continue after it makes impact with a single node, and then continue to bounce around in the scene. What's cool about Final Gather is that we actually don't even need to have any lights in our scene whatsoever. We can use the intensity of color in order to illuminate our scene. To start, let's open up our render settings, and Final Gather is part of Mental Ray, and it's located under the Indirect Lighting tab. We can see there's a rollout down here at the bottom for Final Gather. And to activate it, we just need to check Final Gather. Before we do that, I'm going to switch back to my Common menu and scroll down to the very bottom and go to Render Options. And I want to double check and make sure that Enable Default Light is turned off. We do not want this on. Typically, Maya will shut this off if we have a light in our scene, but we're not going to have a light in the scene, so we want to make sure that that doesn't activate one. We'll go back and let's see what our scene is currently rendering without Final Gather. So I'll just hit the render button, and this will render my current frame. And we get pitch black. That's exactly what we're hoping for. We want to start with absolutely nothing, and then we'll slowly introduce light into our scene. Okay, now I'll come back and we'll turn Final Gather on. And let's just close that and we'll hit render again. Now we see that it's taking a lot longer to render, but we're still not getting any real light in our scene yet. We're also seeing that it's rendering differently. It's rendering using Final Gather tiles. And that's just a way to preview our rendered image prior to it finishing. We can often see little problems in the render through those tiles, and then we can stop the render and make changes before it does a full lengthy rendering. In this case, we could tell that nothing was rendering. It was rendering black. So I could hit escape, kill the render, and then make adjustments. Let's just minimize that. And what's happening here? We have no light. Instead of creating an actual light, I'm going to go into my camera and change the background environment color. This is located in the attribute editor. And if we scroll down towards the bottom, we'll see a rollout here for environment. We can click on that and change the background color. Let's just make it white. We'll go back up and let's hit render again. The first thing we'll see are those Final Gather tiles. This time I can tell something is definitely rendering. Final Gather is using the intensity from that background color to shoot light into my scene. And now we get our finished render, rendering out at 27 seconds at a very low quality. I'll just click to save that particular image. And as we look at the scene here, we can see that we're really kind of losing a lot of detail. Now there's a couple of quality settings that we want to adjust here. I'm going to open up my render settings. And our top one here is really the most expensive one. By increasing the accuracy, we will improve our Final Gather results, but it's also going to increase our render time. I'm going to raise this up to 300. And then go to point density. Point density is going to increase the amount of points to be computed. This will also increase our render time. But when we have more points, that's basically giving us more points of light. The higher amount of points we have, the more they can get into individual nooks and crannies of our geometry. So we'll raise that up to 10. And then we have our point interpolation. This will blend between the amount of rays that we have in our scene. Right now it's set to 10. I'm going to leave that right there. That's a fairly good number. We'll see what we get and then maybe lower it down. The point interpolation is not very costly, so having it higher or lower is not going to make a huge impact to our render. This image is saved. Let's go ahead and render. But since we increased those quality settings, I'm only going to render a small section, and I'll just draw a region there and use the render region button. Now that greatly increased our quality. Let's save that image. And if we compare it to our previous render, we can barely see the windows in that first frame. By increasing the accuracy and point density, it really makes them punch out. And now we can pick up all of that detail that should be out there in the distance. Now we still have some quality issues. The image looks like it's breaking up. We get lots of little artifacts there. To control that, we want to go to the Quality tab. Now this has nothing to do with Final Gather. This is separate. This is in our sampling, and we have a general quality slider here that allows us to increase the overall quality of all of the anti-aliasing in our scene, which will make a huge impact on the final render. So let's save this image, and we'll do, again, just a small regional render there, and take a look how that quality impacts our render. And now a comparison. You can see all those little artifacts breaking the image up there. Now with an increased quality, it cleans the image up. You can probably notice it mostly right down here on this pole as I go back and forth between the image there. Now increasing the overall quality will also increase your render time. I'm going to minimize that, and I'm going to go back to that camera and let's turn off this background color. We'll just set that to black. So now no light intensity will hit our scene here. And I'm going to choose indirect lighting, and I'm going to create an IBL node. And we'll go into the IBL settings, and we're going to use the texture type here, which will then open up this attribute, and I can change that attribute to white. Now this is basically doing the same exact thing that we just did with our camera and that background color, except with this we can also use light emission and have yet another quality setting here. We'll scroll down, and I'm just going to open those render stats, and we're going to come back to that. Let's do a quick render, and we'll do full screen this time. This might take a little bit longer. I'm going to kill the render. I'm going to hit escape, and I want to kill it because I can see that it's taking a lot longer than I want it to, and the overall quality is causing that problem, and you can tell by the Final Gather squares there and how slow it's progressing. I'm going to go back to my render settings, go to quality, and let's drop this back down. While we're at it, I'm going to also drop my Final Gather accuracy and point density back to their defaults. Then we'll choose to render again. And immediately I can see it going faster, but I can also see the point density in that Final Gather image is much larger. And now our render has finished. It's taken 1 minute and 50 seconds in order to complete that render, because now with our Final Gather and our IBL node, we're emitting a lot more light into the scene. Now what we can do, if we look down here, we have an attribute to adjust Final Gather color effects. We can choose this, and this works with the IBL node whether we have Final Gather on or not. When the IBL node works, it automatically uses a Final Gather rendering algorithm to figure out its lighting. But in this case, since we are using Final Gather, we can choose our color gain here, and we can change the value, which will intensify the light values coming in from that IBL node. We can also change the color. We can make it more of a blue sky, go a little darker, and then we can render that with that blue sky image in there. And we can also adjust how much light the Final Gather is affecting using the primary diffuse scale or secondary diffuse scale. So if our scene is too dark, we can click on these nodes here and actually change that value so that it's higher than 1. We'll just set that to 2 for our primary diffuse, and let's go ahead and do one last render here. We'll save that image and render. There we go, and our render has finished up, and you can see that that color gain from the IBL node bringing in that blue color, and then the primary color scale recapturing some of that light back because we doubled it, so we kind of took the color down with the gain, but then brought it back in with our Final Gather diffuse scale. The rest of this, that high grain look that we're seeing there, is all quality settings. So we'd want to increase the quality on the IBL node as well as in our render settings in the overall quality for sampling. Remember, these will really increase our render times. We could probably end up going from a minute 29 to upward of 20 to 30 minutes per frame with this current setup.